Our next speaker is Deb Glickson, and Deb is here today from the National Academy of Sciences and the NRC, it's National Research Council, and she's going to be talking a little bit about their work. Deb?
So I think it's both good and bad that I'm following Fran. The great thing is that I have no need for context slides at all in any of my stuff. The bad thing is that she stole basically all of my punchlines. So I'm actually going to start, I'm trying to broaden this out a little bit because I am going to be talking mostly about our report on responding to oil spills in the U.S. Arctic marine environment, but we have a few other activities going on, so I figured I'd hit them as well. But before I do that, for those of you in the audience who are not familiar with the National Academy of Sciences, I thought I'd give you a little bit of background, because you either know us very well or you have no idea who we are. So just to start out with, we're a non-governmental, nonprofit organization. The weird thing that puts us in a little bit of a strange space is that we were chartered by Congress back in the 1800s to provide independent advice to the nation on science and technology policy. So basically, I work for the National Research Council, which is a piece of the National Academy of Sciences. And what we do is we pull together volunteer experts on different topics so that we can provide recommendations to the government so that they can then make policy decisions. Sometimes they listen to us, sometimes they don't, but we often hope that we have some impact. Our reports are the most well-known, but we do have a lot of other things that we do. If you have any questions about the National Academies, I or my colleagues would be happy to answer them. But moving on from there, there are a few different things that are happening at the academies right now that are related to oil spill response, oil spill research in general. We have the Transportation Research Board, and they've done a billion studies on a lot of different things, spills of emulsified oils. They did a risk assessment in the Aleutian Islands. I work for the Division of Earth and Life Studies. We tend to be the more science-based. We're the ones who just did this responding to oil spills in the Arctic, but we also did one on ecosystem approaches with the Deepwater Horizon. And now we have a new program called the Gulf Program. And they have three main focuses there. I think they're about in their second year of operations. They have three main focuses on R&D for human health, oil system safety, and environmental resources. They're looking at education and training and environmental monitoring. So switching back to the Division on Earth and Life Studies, one of the studies that's going on right now is that they're looking at dilbit. And so they had one study that came out already that basically was asked to analyze the likelihood of a release compared to other crude oils. And guess what they found? That basically there was nothing unique to dilbit. And I thought to myself, gee, I wish I had worked on this study, because basically they came up with an answer and then they could just walk away from it. It's probably very short. The second study that they're working on now is actually what are the consequences should a release actually happen? And that study is underway right now. It's expected to be complete at the end of next year. So now moving into the Arctic, I can skip everything on this slide except for the last part, which is that after Deepwater Horizon, we started talking seriously about doing a National Academy study on oil spill response in the Arctic. This is something that actually we at the academies had been interested in for probably 8 years prior to Deepwater Horizon. And we had talked to people, and we really didn't have any great interest. And after Deepwater Horizon, a lot of things changed. So this is an exceptionally small version of what the study was. And again, as a non-governmental organization, we rely upon sponsors who basically give us funding, and then we provide them recommendations. So at the bottom, you'll notice there's a pretty big mix of sponsors for this particular study. We had federal agencies, we had industry through API, we had nonprofits, we had actual, on-the-ground people. And so it was an interesting study because we really tried to draw together this broad community. Notice there are four main things we focused on: scenarios, preparedness, response and cleanup, and environmental baselines. I'm going to talk a little bit about the scenarios, but just a little bit, and then I'm going to talk about the underlying needs that I think feed into the scenarios. So when the committee had to go through and try to figure out what scenarios they wanted to talk about, they basically ended up breaking things into sort of probability versus impact. And so I threw up here, the stuff that they were looking at. What are the probabilities? Well, what's the condition of your vessel? Do you have good maps and charts? What's the weather like? What's the decisions that are being made, on that ship at that time? And then there are the impacts that go along with that. What kind of oil is being released? You know, what's the geology in the area? I like the geology. What's the oceanographic condition? You know, how are things reacting? Is this a very, rich ecosystem or not? And then is there response infrastructure and trained people available? And then I threw in one at the end that actually wasn't in this part of the report, but I think it actually has a piece that is very important, and it's, is this a US Arctic oil spill only, or does this start to involve other nations? Because as we know, there are no walls in the ocean that stop the oil from moving between international boundaries. So we came up with this scenario and risk matrix area. So there's probability on one side, magnitude on the other, and we basically had 7 scenarios. And what was actually really interesting about this was that I think when we went into this study, a lot of people thought we were really thinking about what was happening with the energy industry in the Arctic. And what we came out with was that more of our scenarios were related to shipping. And so we looked at a passenger vessel, we looked at oil tankers, we even looked at the tug and barges that sort of move through the coast. And then we moved into the oil and gas industry with pipeline breaks, wellhead blowouts, and then also land-based oil tanks. Now, I shouldn't sort of overstate this because this takes up about 3 pages of our 100-page report. So if you'd like to read more about the scenarios, please pick up the report. It's free. So take it away. So I'd like to move into what the underlying issues and needs are for these scenarios. And you're going to notice that I think everything that's on one of these slides is something that was talked about yesterday or just when Fran was up here. So the first one is benchmark data. So as you heard yesterday, not a whole lot of baseline available in the Arctic. We actually chose not to call it baseline. We called it benchmark data because baseline sort of implies that there's a static condition. And as we know, it's a rapidly changing Arctic. And so really you need to benchmark those conditions. They're continuing to change. You can't just rely on data that came from 1972. It doesn't work that way anymore. So here are just a few of the key benchmarks that we thought were important, looking at fish, birds, marine mammals, their distribution, their abundance, rates of change for key species, and sensitivity of key species to hydrocarbons. So again, you don't necessarily need to know every single thing about every single species, but you need to understand which are the critical pieces for your ecosystem. So what's needed? Just like everybody else, right? You need a system that integrates this data so that you can actually look at it as a whole. You need to have a long-term system. You need to have a community-based system. You need to pull in those people who are not necessarily just academic scientists. It needs to be used for more than just oil spill response. It would be great if this was something that could be valuable for the whole community. You need forecasting. And then the other thing that we thought was very important is that you need to have accurate charting and mapping, because that's a real big issue in Alaska. So the next thing that we thought was really useful in terms of thinking about Arctic oil spills, again, I think this is something that Admiral Allen said yesterday, which is you need a long-term Arctic oil spill R&D program. And that really did kind of die after Exxon Valdez. And so we're noticing that that is being revitalized, but we thought that was very important, really that you start thinking about oil behavior, oil spill response, and improved data. So here comes the most controversial piece of my slide, I think, which is that the committee also recommended that there be a systematic program of controlled field releases in the Arctic. And that this happen not with oranges, not with simulants, but that this happen with oil in the Arctic because it needs to be done before we have an actual oil spill. So I'm going to pick on the Coast Guard for a minute. With apologies to all of our other sponsors that we didn't pick on specifically, Dave. So we really did end up sort of hammering a little bit at the Coast Guard, and that was because we noticed that there are a lot of needs. And I don't think that these are things that they have not heard before. But really, there needs to be an enhanced Arctic presence in the Arctic if you're going to think about responding to oil spills. There need to be longer Arctic assignments. They need to be able to really gain that expertise and stay there as opposed to moving on to another area, especially for the tribal liaisons. There needs to be sustained funding. So as I said, these are recommendations. I don't have any money. It's not gonna help, don't look at me. But the other thing that, that they said is that we think the Coast Guard was looking at evaluating Bering Strait traffic, and maybe they need to look at expediting that so that we know whether it's warranted or not. basically what we found is that, and the Coast Guard knows this, there's a lot of significant vulnerabilities for the U.S. Arctic missions. And so moving forward on that would be very helpful. I think Fran hit almost pretty much everything on this slide. When you're talking about spills in the Arctic, lack of infrastructure is really going to be an issue. Whether that's talking about communications, whether that's talking about supply chains, whether it's talking about where you put your people. We heard a lot about floating hotels yesterday. And then it also includes community infrastructure. Basically how we interact with the communities that are there, what kind of training they're getting, and bringing in their knowledge to help with the spill response in the future. And I think this is my last slide. Ha-ha. So again, not something that we did not hear yesterday over and over again, and that's the oil spill toolbox. And it's that no single technique is going to apply in every situation, but we need to have everything on the table so that we're able to use it when the situation arises. And again, NEBA is one of those ways that we can do this.
Thank you, Deb.